Chapter 29. So you've stayed here for 2,000 years? Dis asked Fathom. Well, the golem swallowed. I guess I have. He seemed disturbed by this fact. Didn't you realize how long it had been? Dis asked. I kept track for a while, Fathom muttered. After the first year, it got a little difficult to remember what day I was on. 730,500 days, 12 hours, 23 minutes, and 42 seconds. Give or take a few days, Dis said, his voice cold. Impressive, Fathom said, his voice lightening. But my memory was never as good as yours. After they trapped me here, I just lost interest after a while. Slept a lot. So, nothing new? Dis asked, a smile creeping across his face. The golem rolled what was left of his body onto his side so he could better face Dis. I knew that one day you would come for me and set everything right. I had faith in you, my friend. This gave Dis pause. He hadn't come here to help his friend. Hell, he hadn't known his friend was alive. Don't worry, I will avenge us all. I've already killed Gaia. Ha ha! Fathom laughed victoriously. Thank you. She is the one that turned me into this thing. He gestured at the rubble of his remains, his face twisting in disgust. She took my agility, my stealth. You were the one with power. I had shadows. He examined his friend, the black lines running up his neck towards his face, the streaks of white bleeding through his black hair. Though I guess you have the shadows deeper than I ever did, now. Why didn't you escape? Dis asked. Fathom had always been clever. It was his main weapon. He couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag, but he could make the bag set itself on fire. The curse she placed on me is incomplete. It is slowly turning me to stone, then the stone to dust. He lifted his hand and pressed a finger against the barrier. If I step even an inch outside this bubble, he pressed the tip of his finger through and it disintegrated. Poof, gone. I suppose if it had ever gotten to me, all I would really have to do was shut off the barrier and let the curse finish its business. I'm not sure how, but I'll find a way to fix you, Dis said. Gaia is dead, so she can't stop what she started, but her powers are out there somewhere. We just have to figure out where, then take them for ourselves. We'll be able to fix you. Thank you. Fathom was moved by Dis's words. He had accepted his fate a long time ago, and for the first time in 2 millennia, he was feeling hope. What happened to our home? Dis said, gesturing behind him. The people refused to believe you had simply chosen to turn evil, Fathom said. You know what the punishment for blasphemy is. The gods, together, razed the area. Gaia cursed the land to remain infertile. Felvar pelted the buildings with thunder and wind. Ogun allowed his flames to deliver justice to those that it would. Lyr killed the hidden, and Cronus locked their souls into their buried bodies. When the sundering started, the populace fled towards the mountains, hoping to appeal to the gods. That was where the flames caught them, and Gaia buried them before Cronus locked them away. Silence followed his words. Dis felt crushed. He had single-handedly led his people to destruction, but only because they were loyal to him. The fires of hatred burned even stronger in his chest. I have a longer list than I first thought, he said. Suddenly he felt his link to Lyra weaken. No, he whispered. He stood up, feeling their bond grow thinner and thinner. He started to panic and beat his fist against the barrier. No, 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 no. The color fled his hair and black vines wrapped his body. His eyes dark and black as coal, a single ring of gold sitting in its middle. He let out a roar and pushed his hand through the barrier. It fought him, pushing so hard against his entry that he felt like the flesh might rip free from the bone underneath. What's wrong? Fathom asked, frightened by the display before him. Not her, not again, Dis said, determination ringing through his voice. He pushed and forced himself through the barrier, feeling like he was being torn to pieces with each inch. The barrier scoured the black lines from his skin, the white from his hair, and forced the color back into his eyes. The dark whisper of his powers had turned to a scream in his mind as they begged him to stop. As suddenly as he had become a god, he found himself human again. I have to save her, he said, looking down at his friend. Goodbye, Fathom. With these last words, he took off in a sprint towards the door to the house, kicking it open and rushing inside. Shadow stepped out from behind the corner of the house. Was any of what you talked about true? Cyrus asked Fathom. Why would we lie to each other? Fathom responded. Cyrus nodded, then took off after Dis. Wait, child, Fathom yelled, causing Cyrus to slide to a stop. You cannot save whoever he has set his sight on. You cannot save them. He made sure to emphasize each word. Run. If you have any sense, run now. Whatever is going on in there has set him to his most dangerous mood. I can't abandon my friends, Cyrus said, then ran through the door. Fathom watched for a moment, waiting to see if anyone else would show up outside. He rolled over and started pulling himself towards the southwest corner of the bubble. Those children reminded him of his little traveling group when he was young, but he loved his friend, and he had to do something to help him. Why are there so many swords in this one room? Roland asked himself. Looking around, he could see swords of every shape and size covering the walls of this room, not to mention the fact that the room itself was bigger than most of the houses back in Hedsum. He let out a sigh and started picking through the various weapons. He would pick one up, look at it for a second, decide it wasn't the one he wanted, and throw it into the middle of the room. He had only gone through about 10 swords when he heard some noise from outside the room. Holding a short sword, he stepped out of the mini armory and back into the main room. Faintly, he thought he could hear sounds like someone was walking around upstairs. Sarah stepped out of a doorway across the room from Roland. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "Yes." Paused and listened for a moment. "Do you think Cyrus came back in and decided to just go ahead and go upstairs?" "I doubt it," she said. "I'm going to go check," Roland said. "Can you handle it by yourself?" Sarah asked. "What I mean is, do you want me as backup?" "Yeah, I think I'll be..." He broke off mid-sentence as he heard a man's voice shout. "Stay here and protect the box." He took off in a sprint, running for the stairs he had passed on the way inside. As he turned the corner and started up the stairs, he realized he was still holding onto a sword. He tossed it aside and drew his own from his belt. Finding the source of the noise wasn't difficult. The house was big, but there was only one door sitting ajar that he could see from the top of the stairs. He slowed down, suddenly aware he might be better off with some element of surprise. He slid carefully up beside the doorway and peered around the corner. Inside the room, he saw Sean bent over someone on the floor, twisting a dagger cruelly in the person's back. He didn't hesitate anymore. "What the hell are you doing?" He burst into the room, leveling his sword at the bully. All the anger he had held back after Severin's death bloomed anew inside him. "Finishing something I started," Sean said, jerking the dagger out of the person's back and standing up. "This doesn't concern you. Just leave." Now that Sean wasn't blocking his view, Roland realized it was Lyra on the floor. "You bastard," Roland said, stepping forward. Just as he was preparing to swing at Sean, he felt his feet leave the ground. Suddenly, he was flying across the room. "Out of my way." The deep voice that had haunted his dreams since the night of the village filled his mind. The voice of Dis. Dis walked forward, his stride saying he wouldn't be stopped. Sean didn't seem ready to move, but once Dis reached him, the decision was made for him. Dis jerked the knife from the boy's hands, plunged it into his shoulder, then threw him headfirst into the closet wall. Dis knelt down and gently pulled Lyra onto his lap. "What have they done to you?" He ran a hand down her cheek and paused to feel for a pulse at her throat. Her heartbeat was still there, but slow and weak. "Don't worry, everything will be all right," he promised her. Fathom was quickly figuring out that dragging yourself across the ground with one arm wasn't easy. He weighed several 100 pounds, and he had never enjoyed hard labor at any point in his life. But something was wrong, and this was all he knew to do to help. Fortunately, he didn't have far to go. The little box he needed was just a few feet away from where he had collapsed. Still, those few feet had been difficult to cover. "Damn it, you better be thankful," he said, pulling a clump of grass free from the ground. He brushed aside the dirt and revealed a shiny metallic surface, perfectly square, with a small domed section near its center. He hadn't really enjoyed the time he had spent inside this prison, but he hadn't hated it either. If he had had even one person as company, this isolated lifestyle would have suited him quite nicely. He had been able to sleep as much as he wanted. He hadn't really needed to eat, so he didn't miss it. But best of all, he had never really had to do work. Overall, other than being boring, it wasn't so bad. Of course, there's only so much boredom a person can take. "I'm not going to ask you to avenge me, my friend," Fathom spoke to himself, a habit he had picked up long ago. "All I'm going to do is ask that you don't mercilessly slaughter all those children. They beat the hell out of me, but I deserved it, really." He looked down at the box for a moment, running his finger around the rim of the little dome. He flipped the dome up, revealing a recessed button, then cursed quite a bit. Of course, it couldn't be that easy. The problem was simple. His fingers were way too big to be able to press the button down. He looked around, hoping to see a stick or something nearby he could grab to press it with. He let out a long, slow sigh, then raised his hand up and extended a finger. Slowly, he pressed his extended finger against the barrier, trimming it down, making it far narrower. It didn't really hurt, but it certainly wasn't pleasant. "You really owe me big time, you bastard," he said, then jammed his finger down on the button. The effect was instant. The barrier disappeared, and Fathom blew away with the breeze. Sarah found herself in a strange position. She really wasn't sure what she should do. Staying and watching the box was important and was her responsibility. However, if something were to happen to Roland because she was watching some box, a box that she really didn't know why it was important, it wouldn't matter if she survived their adventure. It was like a brother to her. She couldn't let him go into a dangerous situation on his own. "Screw the box," she muttered to herself and started to walk off. Suddenly, though, she could feel her connection to her powers. Her abilities were back, which meant the barrier was gone. She turned and looked at the box. The weird way the crimson colors had floated through the box had vanished. It simply looked like a stone coffin now, at least in the normal world. She tapped into her abilities and immediately tried to close her eyes to block out the blinding light ahead of her. Just above the box, a massive swirl of life energy twisted. At its base, it barely touched the box, licking across the lid, almost as if it were trying to get in. She let go of her abilities and walked forward, running her hand across its lid again. It didn't feel any different, but something had attracted all the energy around it. She felt around the crease where the lid connected with the rest of the box, tracing the line the lid made against the container below it. Cyrus ran into the room. "Sarah, where's Roland? Dis is here." His words faded, confused about what he was seeing. "What's going on?" Sarah looked back at Cyrus over her shoulder, then started to pull the lid up. It opened so easily she barely even felt the lid lift. As soon as the gap between the box and the lid appeared, she no longer needed to use her abilities to see the blinding light of the energy as it flooded into the box. "Thank you, my friend," Dis whispered to himself as he felt his powers flow back into him. A moment of sorrow filled him before the rage washed away the overflow of humanity he had been exposed to. He looked down at Lyra and felt his anger double. Lifting a hand first, he molded a ball of blackness into his palm. "This will give you enough strength to stand against anyone you face." Next, he pushed all of his remaining life energy into the ball, turning it into a swirl of green and black, making it look like two snakes fighting for a room inside the orb. "And with this, you will heal and hopefully stay sane." He laid his hand flat on her stomach, pressing the ball of energy into his daughter. She took a deep breath as the power hit her, her back arching, her muscles going rigid. Then she relaxed and drifted back into a deep slumber. Dis probed her through their link again, checking to make sure the powers he had given her were having the desired effect. Satisfied, he lifted her, stood up, and gently placed her on the bed. He heard the swing coming before it ever connected. He stepped to the side and grabbed Sean's arm. He remembered ripping the boy's hand off, but miraculously he now had a hand made of water with fingers shaped into knives. "Someone has been meddling," he tisked. Not surprising, but annoying nonetheless. He then jerked Sean's arm off and tossed it aside. "You, child, were never a match for me." He stepped forward and backhanded Sean, sending him reeling to the floor. "You should have run like the coward your kind are known to be." He stepped forward, planning on pummeling the child some more before killing him, but had to jump backwards out of the path of an oncoming sword. "He's scum, but I can't stand by and let you murder him," Roland said. "You should stay out of this," Dis warned. Roland didn't pause to think about what he was doing. Instead, he wrapped his sword in electricity and started taking swings at Dis. He was using the fastest combination of attacks he knew how to make, slicing in short, quick bursts. No matter how hard he tried, though, Dis didn't even seem to have to work to step out of the way. "You were too obvious," Dis said, sidestepping another swing and giving Roland a rap on the head. "You broadcast your attacks as if you were trying to get my attention." He ducked under another swing and delivered an uppercut, dazing Roland and knocking him down. Roland's sword slid across the floor, knocked free in the same instant he lost his sense of up and down. "I have enough sense to understand what you were doing." Dis stepped over Roland and grabbed his shoulder, lifting him off the ground and pinning him against the wall. "You were even pulling some of your swings to avoid hitting the bed where I put Lyra. Admirable, but foolish to do when fighting for your life." Dis kicked the sword Roland had dropped up and caught it. then immediately impaled Roland through his shoulder, pinning him firmly to the wall. Roland let out a scream as the sword disabled him. "As your reward for being so valorous," Dis said with a slight sneer, "I'll let you live." He turned, leaving Roland hanging by his shoulder, pinned up like a painting. Dis walked over to Sean, who had crawled into a corner and huddled up, trying to staunch the flow of blood from his lost arm. "You, though, must die." He grabbed Sean by the neck and lifted him up off the ground. He drew his other hand back and plunged it deep into Sean's stomach. Cyrus and Sarah arrived in the doorway just in time to see Dis's hand bury itself in Sean. Cyrus stopped them both and started to push Sarah back. "You need to run." "Don't worry," Dis shouted out at them. "This rodent is my only interest." He let go of Sean's neck, holding him aloft by his spine with his other hand. "And I am about done here." The black lines covering Dis's body started crawling down the arm leading into Sean. They writhed as they moved, pulsing, seeming excited. Suddenly, the entire upper half of Sean's body exploded as a pillar of tendrils burst out of him, piercing into the walls behind and beside him and tearing apart the roof above him. As the mist of gore dispersed, the pillar slowly drew itself back into Dis's body. The lines all crawled back into place, coming to rest like a lion napping after a meal. "Now, I don't want to kill you, but what will I do with you three?" he said, moving towards Cyrus and Sarah. "I guess I don't really owe you too many favors, though, unlike the kebab over there." He motioned at Roland as he spoke. He started to lift his hand and point at Cyrus when roots burst from the floor and wrapped around him, binding his arms to his sides. The anger from before snapped back into place as he killed off the roots with his touch, breaking them to dust as he jerked his arms free. "So, the liar's apprentice finally decided to show up," he snarled. Vines covered in thorns burst from the walls and floor, binding him just as tightly as before. He killed these as well, but it took considerably more effort. I guess it was too much to hope such a simple trick would work, a warm, commanding woman said from behind Cyrus and Sarah. "Too bad. I had hoped we wouldn't have to fight. I only ever won 1 out of every 10 times we sparred." Red-headed Beauty stepped between the two youths into the room. Dis paled, all the anger leaving him and shock taking its place. "Alice?" he whispered. Slowly he moved forward, looking as if the sight of her terrified him. "It can't be. You died. I held your body." "You have always been too quick to jump to conclusions, John." She spoke. The stern resolution she had shown when walking into the room melted away, and sadness took its place. She looked at the man who was once her husband, seeing him for the first time in 2 millennia. Hearing his real name was enough. He reached out to her, trying to stroke her cheek, to feel her for himself and know he wasn't just dreaming. Just as he touched her skin, she shirked away from him. "Don't," she said. The resolution she had entered the room with came back. "Don't touch me. My husband, John, died long ago when he broke a promise. This is the name you have taken, if these memories held the truth. This is who you are, and this is who I'm going to fight." His lips curled into a snarl. "That bitch," he roared in anger. "She turned you into one of us and filled your head with nonsense." "I see the results myself, in front of me, and splattered on the walls around us," Alice said. "He deserved what he received. He tried to kill our daughter." He gestured towards Lyra. "I received memories from Orcus once. Trust me when I say that not everything you learned is accurate. Yes, he did deserve punishment, but not by you," she said. "As for our daughter, it is going to take work to cleanse the taint you have put into her, if I even can." "I saved her," he shouted. "I'm doing everything because of what they did to us. I'm getting our justice. The man I married would never have tainted his daughter with dark powers just to protect her," Alice said, stepping forward and facing Dis down. "The man I loved controlled his rage. It didn't control him. The man I see now is an animal out for revenge, and like an animal, justifying in any way he can." Dis looked away from his wife, and for the first time noticed the sword displayed on the wall. He looked Alice in the eye. "Please, don't fight me," he said, pleading, filling his voice. "Before I was looking for revenge, but revenge is justice in this. Now, I can take their powers and give us back our lives." "Take their powers?" Alice looked where Dis had glanced before. "No." She turned back to him and forced Vines through the walls again, grabbing him and jerking him backwards. "No. This is exactly what you fought to prevent. No one should have the strength of more than one god." Dis ripped through the vines, but before he was finished, Alice was on him, throwing punches and kicks faster than even Severin had. Dis was pushed harder than he had been with any other challenger since awakening. He had trained Alice to fight himself, and if there had ever been anyone alive that could match him, it was her. But he had still been her teacher, not the other way around. He found an opening, caught her kick, then flung her across the room and into a wall. "Don't fight me," he pleaded. "Help me. Together we can take them all down. Then together we can remake reality to put us back into our old lives. Back to where we were before that bastard ever showed up at the door." Alice pushed herself back to her feet. The most amazing thing about becoming a god, it seemed, was not taking nearly as much damage from a hit like that as she should have. "I'll never betray the world just for my own satisfaction. At one point in time, neither would you." She started circling Dis, forcing him to follow her. "You killed Gaia, but let's see how far you get against an actual warrior instead of a strategist." She swept his legs out from under him with a tree root, then broke a tree branch off that had suddenly pierced its way into the room and started using it as a staff. Dis was getting more and more angry with each passing second. She was his wife. His child was on the bed asleep. He had the family back that he thought had been lost. It seemed to him that not only had the gods made him believe they had killed her, but they had tainted her against him. He focused his energy into his hands. Darkness coated them like blood. He caught the tree branch and ripped it away from Alice, then knocked her against the far wall. Instead of chasing her down, he dashed to the sword and ripped it from its rack. "You cannot win," Alice said from the floor. "I'll show you I can," Dis said. He stepped towards her, then moved past her towards the window. "But first I'll finish getting my revenge." The shadows making up his clothes fell away from the upper part of his body. His wings sprouted from his back as he flung himself at the wall and burst outside, trailing feathers behind him. Alice stood up and looked out the hole he had left, watching as Dis shrank into a speck in the distance. She heard a noise behind her and turned to see the two youths from the door trying to get their friend off the wall. As the young man lifted, the girl pulled the sword free. Alice walked over to them. "Let me see him," she said, and the couple stepped aside. She placed her hand on the young man's shoulder and started stitching him back together. "Thank you for trying to protect my daughter. I didn't see whatever happened, but I doubt John would have let you live if you had done otherwise." She had finished healing him by the time she had finished the sentence. "What do we do now?" Cyrus asked. "Simple," Roland said from the floor. "We go after him." "What?" Sarah said. "Look at what he did to you. We're no match for him." "Not alone," Roland said, "but we have to help Felvar." Alice was impressed. The young man reminded her a lot of John when he had been about the same age. They all three showed some potential, if for nothing more than their courage. "Fine," Sarah said. "Accepting that we must help, how do you propose we catch up to him? Unless you have learned that flying trick I saw some of the men doing back in Drakenfell, I don't think we'll get there in time to be of any use." Alice cleared her throat. While the youths were talking, they seemed to have forgotten she was there. "You do realize I am the new god of life, right?" she said. "I can get you to Felvar before Dis even gets to Felvar." She wasn't sure she wanted to bring these kids along with her, but she didn't feel she had any right to deny them the finish to their journey. "You," she pointed at Cyrus, "please pick up my daughter and carry her for me." "Yes, madam," Cyrus said. He walked over to the bed, and Alice heard him whisper, "Lyra, sorry I'm touching you. I know you never liked others to so much as pat your shoulder." Then he leaned over and picked her daughter up, surprisingly gently for such a cumbersome-looking man. "Lyra," she thought to herself, "what a beautiful name." He pushed a moment of sadness down, parceling it away to be dealt with later, then stood and seemed to grab the air. Much quicker than Gaia had ever been able to do, Alice ripped a hole into the meeting room of the gods. Chapter 30. Elusio was spotless. At least that was Roland's initial assessment. It looked exactly as he had imagined the meeting place of the gods would look. It felt as if he were stepping into a room made of clouds and floored with rocks. The table in the middle of the room looked exactly like something he would expect important people to meet around, and each chair seemed to scream out the personality of the god it was meant for. He was so distracted it took him a moment to realize they were not alone. Standing directly ahead of them was a tall, bald man with a thick beard. He looked old, but still decidedly dangerous, just like Severin. "Well," the man said, his voice deep and warm, "it seems our fledgling goddess has decided to make her initial appearance." He walked over and stood directly in front of Alice. "What should I call you?" "You know my name, Cronus," Alice said, not even trying to hide the aggression in her voice. "I'm not a pretender. Alice is good enough for me." The realization that the man was a god made Roland feel like a fool. Who else would be here? He thought to himself. As he watched the exchange, he saw how shockingly fast Cronus's expression changed. At Alice's words, the smile vanished and was replaced with a vacant, disinterested look. I thought I'd play the part, Cronus replied in a dull monotone. Since you aren't interested in games, we'll skip the ceremony. You aren't welcome here. All the gods are entitled to use this place for travel. The only exception is the god of chaos, Alice replied with the same anger as before. Yes, and seeing as how you are his wife, I decided you shouldn't be allowed to have access either. He walked a few steps back, turning his back to Alice. Your loyalty cannot be assured, not yet at least. It would be unwise to let someone that is untested just waltz in and assume a position. Isn't that what you and your little group did? She strode forward, clearly deciding to add actions to her words. You waltzed in and took over the position of gods? Right now, I'm trying to get myself and this group of children to Felvar and warn him about Dis's approach. Stand aside. She started to grab Cronus's shoulder, then stopped. She didn't stop because she changed her mind. She stopped because suddenly she couldn't move. You would be wise not to try that again, child. Cronus turned and faced Alice. It's true that the gods agreed this place could be used by all, but keep in mind that the door is opened by my powers. While you are here, your powers are dampened. Mine are not. He lifted his hand and pushed Alice back. Roland and Cyrus barely managed to keep her from falling flat. Seeing as how I have no desire to keep you here forever, I will let you leave, Cronus said arrogantly. I will even go so far as to deposit you at Felvar's home. He raised a hand and suddenly a hole split in the air in front of them. Alice's eyes hadn't strayed from the god of time. They burned with an anger Roland hadn't seen in anyone else except Severin. She let out a breath and seemed to calm, then nodded for the group to walk through, with herself taking up the rear. Once they were all inside the hole, they realized it seemed to lead only to blackness. By the way, they heard Cronus call, I never specified when I would deliver you. A bit of a delay should be punishment enough for your rudeness. As his last words rang out, the portal they had walked through snapped shut. Dust billowed up around Dis's feet as he landed in the outpost. Disor, he called. The inky form of the demon dripped up from the ground, solidifying in front of its master. We are here, sire. Are you finished preparing? Dis asked. The inky lines on his skin seemed to flow, each word pulsing with anger. Yes, sire, Disor replied. Dis merely nodded before taking flight again, his wings having lost all their feathers, the flesh sickly and taut across the thick bones now more akin to the wings of a bat than birds. The air rushed past his face, but his vision never blurred as it was locked on the gates that led into Drakenfell. The distance passed quickly, but on his approach he saw exactly what he expected. The tiny forms of men, growing larger with each second, forming up along the path into Drakenfell proper. The Thunder God was prepared for him, or at least he thought so. Dis slowed and held himself aloft mere yards from the gate and spoke. Warriors, I address you now to give you a fair warning. I once stood by the side of the coward as you do now, fighting his battles for him, protecting him from ever facing any real danger. It is thanks to me that Orcus did not sweep over all the pathetic beings you know as gods, and in return for my service I was punished. I was led to believe my wife had been slain, and with her our child. I was forced into a position of the god of evil, forced into being the god of death. But I wasn't alone in my punishment, even if I didn't know it. Dis held out his arms, and the black ichor that covered his body in lines started to jet out, piercing into the ground. My people, the inhabitants of the place you now call the Wastes, were punished with me because they refused to believe the words of the gods when they lied about me and my actions. Because they had doubt, they were buried with their souls locked inside their bodies. A burst of energy sent a ripple across the men gathered behind Drakenfell's gate. The ground between Dis and the gate started to crack, and a small vibration ran through the air. As the black lines reformed around Dis's body, arms started to burst from the ground. The remnants of what was once human beings pulled themselves free from the ground that had held them for 2,000 years. Their flesh desiccated and mummified by time and heat, with their bodies hardened by the magic Dis had used to free them. My people were meant to stay buried, a secret about the fragility of the ego of the gods. Instead, I have set them free. We are here to claim our justice. You have one simple choice. Are you willing to die for a coward? Dis smiled as he saw the shock spread over Felvar's troops. He didn't expect a single individual to back down. Felvar may be a coward, but he knew Felvar's men were not. He didn't mind, though. Their deaths would simply supply more troops for his budding army. Or will you choose to live with honor? You don't have to join me. Just step aside. He let the mist that had been making his shirt fade, focusing that energy into his body instead of using it to pretend to be clothed. He forced that energy down into his arms, coating his forearm and hands with the same black essence that was written all over his body, but more focused and concentrated. Dis, he heard a shout, just as he expected. Come face me here away from my troops. I don't want to hurt them while I bury you again. He had known that if he provided a situation dramatic enough, Felvar would respond. Instead of immediately setting off after his foe, he set foot on the ground. Disur, Shodden, come here, he commanded. Immediately the form of the two demons appeared before him. Disur, lead my army against Felvar's men. You may fight as you please, but no prisoners. Kill them all. He waved his hand, casually dismissing Disur. As for you, go back to the underworld, prepare the others. Every warrior of Felvar's that falls should immediately be possessed by whatever demon gets to it first. We're going to start building our numbers. The Shade smiled. Are you sure Disur should be allowed such a position as the leader of your army? Would you prefer the job instead? Dis snapped. My apologies, sire. The Shade continued. If I may ask, where is your daughter? You may not ask, Dis said, looking down at the Shade. Get to work. I have other business to take care of. With that, Dis took off, flying towards Felvar's mansion, preparing to confront the enemy he despised most of all. Chapter 31. Felvar stood prepared, clad in armor, hammer hefted over his shoulder, in front of Gaia's dolmen. He was waiting, having called out his challenge to Dis. Before every battle he had ever been in, there was always some sort of anxiety, some fear of what was to come. Not this time. Now all he felt was anger. He didn't have long to wait. Dis's form floated slowly to the ground 20 yards in front of him. This creature looked vastly different from the one that had awoken not so long ago. His skin, marred by oozing black lines, had gone ashen. His hair had turned a filthy gray, and his eyes had gone black, the only color being a small circle of gold near their center. Instead of the raven wings that had swept him away from Gaia and Felvar, he now bore the taut-skinned wings of a bat, and clutched in his right hand was Reaver. Felvar had no doubt that the beast before him no longer held even the faintest vestige of John Morgenstern. Part of me is sad to see you in this state, Felvar said. You should be sad to see me, period, Dis replied, his tone a perverted version of the sarcasm Morgenstern had used in life. I'm here to finish what you started. Well, finish your involvement. The scars have been made. Felvar let his free hand drop, resting on the shoulder of Gaia. They will stay forever. Win or lose, what's done is done. For now, Dis smiled. I have one last gift for you. A small crimson orb pushed its way out of Dis's chest. He grabbed the orb and then tossed it towards Felvar. Without thinking, the god snatched the orb out of the air. He paled when he realized he was holding a heart. You could never seem to win her heart in life, Dis said. So I thought the least I could do was bring it to you now. Her heart's all yours. Felvar placed the heart, gently, beside Gaia's body. He grabbed the handle of his hammer firmly with both hands and threw himself across the field towards Dis. Roland was livid. They were trapped, but he had no idea how nor what they could do about it. He could see that they were in the middle of Drakenfell, but everything past a few feet seemed to blur. Any time a member of the group approached this boundary, they simply couldn't push past. How long is he going to keep us locked away? He asked. I have no idea, Alice said. A few hours, a few days, a few years. All are well within his capabilities. She was watching her daughter, Lyra. Lyra had woken shortly after they landed inside the trap, but she hadn't spoken to anyone present and simply watched her mother. She behaved like a trapped animal waiting to be put down. And before you ask, I have no idea if I can do anything about it. I'm still trying to process everything that was given to me. Well, that's fantastic, Roland said. He looked around and surveyed everyone. Alice and Lyra were continuing their staring contest. Sarah was sitting right in the middle of the cube, but Cyrus was sitting with his eyes closed and hands pressed flat against the limits of the barrier. He wanted to ask Cyrus what he was doing, but decided that interfering might be a bad idea. Instead, he wandered over to Sarah and sat beside her. "What are you up to?" "It's so weird," Sarah said. "I can feel life all around us, but it's moving around so quickly that I cannot follow it." Her voice trailed off. "I can also sense a large nothing nearby. It is as if there were hundreds of the spiders from the forest, all gathered in one place." "That must be Dis's minions," Alice said. "They have their own signature within the land of the living. The battle has begun." "Got it!" Cyrus's sudden burst of sound startled everyone. "I can get us out. All he has done is isolate us from the time we would normally be flowing through. It's like the technique Severin taught me to let me fight and seem to move at lightning speed." "We don't need an explanation," Alice said. "Just pop the damn bubble." Cyrus let the moment of happiness drop from his face and returned to being all business. He stood and placed his hands against the barrier. "Be ready. It doesn't feel very good to jolt back into sync with everything else." He took a breath, and for a brief moment the space in front of his hands glowed. Then Roland felt like he was getting ready to vomit. He fell to his knees and fought down the dizziness and nausea. The only saving grace, to him, was that only Cyrus had remained standing. "You get used to it over time," Cyrus said. The first to recover was Lyra, but instead of waiting around for everyone else, she seemed to melt into the shadows. "Lyra, wait!" Roland called out. "Don't worry about her. She is her father's beast for now," Alice said, pushing herself to her feet. "Sarah, come with me. We're going to help the wounded at the rear of the battle. Cyrus, you should help the army fight off whatever Dis is sending against Felvar's men. Roland," she turned and locked eyes with the young man, "you can help Felvar fight Dis. They are in front of Felvar's manor. Do not try and fight Dis one-on-one. You cannot win. Not yet, at least. However, you won't be hurt if you take a stray lightning bolt to the chest. So you can be a distraction. Help give Felvar the upper hand." "I'll go with him," Cyrus said immediately. "You'll die," Alice said. "You're the better fighter, but Felvar cannot worry about collateral damage. Roland must go alone for now. I'll join him once I'm sure the lines will hold, which is what your job is." She snapped her eyes back to Cyrus. "I won't be questioned by a child, even one that is well trained. Not because I'm a god, but because I know what the hell I'm doing. Reinforce the lines. They are falling. Right, Sarah?" "So many lights are fading," she said, sadness filling her voice. "Now, let's go and stop wasting time." Alice turned and strode off, leading the way towards the sounds of steel and screams. Roland looked to Cyrus and exchanged a nod, then ran off in the direction of Felvar's manor. Sarah and Alice found themselves right at the rear of Felvar's men. They had been pushed all the way back up the path and were starting to fight in the practice yard. The fierce army of whites continuously flowing forward. As soon as they had reached the yard, Alice had gone to her knees and placed her hands on the ground in front of her. "I'll feed the men energy. Try and keep their strength up as they battle. You look for wounded to pull off the line and give a bit more direct attention to." Sarah had no idea where to start. There seemed to be injured men everywhere. When a member of the army of whites went down, its brothers and sisters would simply trample over it and push forward. The men of the mountain, however, would rotate their wounded to the back lines. Instead of leaving the line, though, these men and women simply waited as emergency defenders. Not hell enough to handle direct fighting, but not cowardly enough to fully retreat. To help herself think, Sarah decided to try the trick she had used against the beast at the watchpost. She unshouldered her bow and, after refreshing her supply from a nearby weapon cache, started firing arrows charged with healing energy into the whites. Just as before, her arrows seemed to unknit the creatures, forcing away some of the essence that gave them life and letting decay take its toll. Being keen fighters, Felvar's men would dispatch any of these marked creatures quickly. "Clever girl," Alice commented. "Try shooting one of the wounded with one of those arrows." "Won't the arrows still do damage?" she asked. "Just try it and see," Alice replied. Sarah sighted a man with a severe gash going across his back, exposing the white of his ribs. She let the arrow loose and waited. The effect was almost instant. She couldn't see the details from where she stood. It was too far, but she could clearly make out the wound closing. Once it seemed the wound had vanished, the arrow popped out of the man's back and fell to the ground, its energy spent. "That'll be useful," Alice said. "You can stick nearby in case I need you." "You did know that's what would happen, right?" Sarah asked. "Ha!" Alice finished drawing out the diagram she had been working on in the dirt. "Of course I didn't. Why would I have ever tried that before?" She raised her hands and slammed them down at the center of the diagram. Intense lines of light traced out every sigil and circle she had drawn. Then cracks dashed across the field to the front lines. Wherever it touched one of Felvar's soldiers, they would start to glow and seem to grow more substantial. If a white crossed the line, it looked to grow thinner, weaker, less real. Well, I won't be moving much for a little while, Alice said, sitting at the center of the circle. Sarah watched the men, looking for Cyrus. She finally spotted him fighting at the thickest knot of creatures she could easily see. She didn't so much see Cyrus as she noticed his staff raising and lowering as he struck, seemingly a few feet ahead of the actual front lines. She should have known he would somehow work his way out into the thick of the enemy lines. She started to comment on this to Alice, then noticed soldiers clutching their legs and falling at the rear. She started sending arrows to each of the fallen, hoping that they could counteract whatever was causing them to fall. As she focused, she finally caught sight of what was happening. Black mist seemed to coalesce for a few seconds near a soldier she was aiming at. Then, in a flash, he had a cut on the rear of his leg. Within a few moments, he suddenly clutched his leg and fell to the ground. Alice, what's happening? Sarah looked over to the goddess, simply to be shocked to silence by the look of anger on the woman's face. Sarah, come sit in my circle. Alice stood. I need you to power it for a moment. Can I? Of course, Alice said. Well, it won't be easy, but you can. Just hold it as long as you can. I shouldn't be gone long. I simply need to go punish my daughter. Alice started to stride away from the circle without another word, so Sarah ran in quickly. At first, she didn't feel like she was having to work at all. She honestly didn't think she was doing anything. It turned out she was quite right. The second Alice was fully out of the circle, Sarah felt like 100 pounds of weight were suddenly dropped on her shoulders. She dropped to her knees, struggled to draw in breath, and had to fight to stay conscious. She focused, though, and calmed herself down. This is difficult, she told herself, but you can do it. Gritting her teeth, she settled in, secretly hoping Alice was as quick as she seemed to believe she would be. Cyrus was lost to the throes of battle. He would feel each muscle tense up as he went through the motion to swing his staff from left to right to left, overhead slam, upward thrust. Each swing required its own set of minuscule movements from the strands of meat that made up his body. Each swing focused his thoughts further, drawing him deeper into the battle trance. His opponents, though plentiful, were woefully inadequate to go against the Time Warden. Their bodies were brittle, their skulls easily shattered, their swings slow. But it was dangerous to underestimate them. He had witnessed several of the mountain men being torn to pieces after being dragged into the midst of the horde. Their strength lay mainly in their numbers, but whatever magic kept them alive also augmented what power their forms should not have been able to produce, and strikes that landed on their armor seemed to have no effect at all. This was why he had swum into the thick of the front lines. By throwing himself out into the middle of the creature's attack formation, he could fight freely. The mountain men fought with hammers and sword, needing precision with their strikes. His staff, however, could cover ample ground and still meet many targets and inflict ample damage. It was swift, clean, and utterly devastating when it made contact. This was the state of mind Cyrus was in when the hooded man made his entrance. He was halfway through an arcing sweep when all the whites in front of him parted. Suddenly, he found himself in the middle of a giant circle, whites behind him pushing towards the soldiers, the whites in front of him shuffling around the outer edges toward the front. That was when he noticed the figure hovering in the air. It was outlined in shadows, the setting sun burning away the horizon behind it, but it appeared to be floating using small, ragged wings. It hovered only a moment more, then landed softly on the ground opposite Cyrus. The figure walked forward, and as it grew closer, its size became very clear. The creature stood 7 feet tall and broader than any man Cyrus had ever seen. It was wearing the tattered robes of a priest, with large holes on the back to accommodate its wings. Its wings were a horror all of their own. They appeared to be 2 mangled limbs with patches of flesh stretched between them. Whether these limbs had been arms or legs, Cyrus couldn't tell. The heir of time has come to test himself, the creature spoke. Its voice was oddly smooth and seemed faintly familiar to Cyrus. We shall test you, and then decide if you are worthy yet to join us. The creature slipped a hand inside its robes and pulled out a single sword. Without saying another word, it rushed toward Cyrus. This thing wasn't nearly as simple as the whites he had been fighting. It had caught him off guard, but even after he started to recover, it took every ounce of his strength, as well as well-honed instincts, to dodge past its blade. That was all he could do, however, dodge. After leading the creature in a full circuit of their impromptu arena, Cyrus finally remembered to start tapping into his abilities. Up until this moment, he hadn't needed them, and had let them slip from his thoughts. He smiled to himself and started to manipulate time in his immediate surroundings, while also trying to speed up time around the creature. The effect gained him some distance, and a chance to go on the attack. He moved in, sure the creature was seeing a blur, and had no idea what direction he was moving in from. He swung his staff low, trying to put the thing on the ground. At the last second, just before his staff made contact, the thing jumped and twisted in midair. By instinct, he flattened himself on the ground and felt the blade the creature held pass mere inches above his head. As soon as he touched the dirt, he rolled to the side and used his momentum to propel him to his feet. "What the hell are you?" he asked, stunned by the thing's reaction speed. The creature paced, forcing him to match its steps to keep his distance. It just watched, a small glow marking its eyes from deep within the hood. Finally, it stopped and plunged its sword into the ground. "We suppose you deserve to know." The thing lifted its hands and pulled back its hood. Its head was the combination of 4 separate faces. Each face seemed to somehow merge about where its ears should start with the face beside it. It was disorienting to look at because somehow each face seemed complete. It was clearly part of the others. Then Cyrus realized why he thought he recognized the voice. The face currently at the front was that of Mathis. "Let us test you, boy. We must see your worth." The monster from Tranvin's Tier had survived, but now he was facing it alone.